Thank you, everyone. So, this is the story of a very dramatic train journey on December the 6th, 1917. A rescue train from the Annapolis Valley on the Dominion Atlantic Railway, which came to the relief of Halifax after the Halifax Explosion. One of the very first rescue trains to arrive in the city. It's a story that's full of drama and surprises and some grim details, but it's also a really important window on the role of railways and the role of local help from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick after the Halifax explosion. A story that I feel has kind of gone somewhat unnoticed. So yeah, if you want to go on the ride with me, we shall go back to 1917 and the story of the rescue train from the Annapolis Valley. And given that we're close to the Christmas season, I'll begin with a Christmas present. This is a watch presented Christmas 1917 to a young woman named Georgina Miner, who was a nurse who was on that rescue train. And she came in to help in Halifax. And in the Christmas time, the Knights of Columbus, the group that hosted her in Halifax, sent her this gift as a way of thank you. I'll return to this gift at the end, but it's kind of one of the very few recognitions of the help that came from towns and cities across the Maritimes after the explosion. So our story is centered on the Dominion Atlantic, the railway that ran from Halifax to Yarmouth with a number of branch lines, a very important regional railway in Nova Scotia. It wasn't some little branch line operation. It had its own main line, 24-hour train service, its own hotels chain, its own steamships, and it was a big force. It created cultural tourism in Nova Scotia, really built the valley's apple crop, and was a major operation. They were centered in Kentville, just to your left. That was their base of operations. But they also had a large terminal in Halifax, and many of the crews lived and worked out of Halifax as well. So our story will begin in the valley and then take us to Halifax. The DAR, as it was widely known, it's the lines in red with the dots of their station. The solid red lines are the intercolonial lines that connected to the DAR that are also part of our story. But this is very much a story of trades based in the valley with the Dominion Atlantic Railway. So this story begins at Wolfville Station very early in the morning in the pre-dawn darkness at 6:15 on December the 6th, when a young Wolfville doctor, Dr. Avery DeWitt, is catching the morning train, the early morning train at 6:15. He's a doctor, military doctor, Major Dr. Avery DeWitt, and he's been called to a meeting in Halifax that morning. So he boards the train in Wolfville Station. And out of habit, he brings his doctor bag with his hypodermics and his morphines just in case something happens. And boy, he'd end up really needing those. The day would take dramatic and unexpected turns for Dr. Avery DeWitt. But he boards the train heading into Halifax for his routine meeting. But bigger events are stirring in Halifax Harbor. Um, I think most of you probably know the basic outlines of the explosion, so I'm not going to go into huge detail about the movements of ships, etc. But the explosion is caused by the explosive cargo aboard the steamship Mont Blanc. You see her in her screen, 320 feet long, packed stem to stern with artillery shells, TNT, gun cotton, picric acid, very unstable explosives, and then to top everything off, barrels and barrels of aviation gas up on the deck. The French had the philosophy of put all your dangerous goods in one ship to minimize the risk. And Mont Blanc arrived in Halifax to join a convoy to take all this explosives across the ocean to the battlefields in France, where it would be used by artillery positions in the trenches. So she arrives in Halifax the night before, waits for the anti-submarine gates to open, and then starts steaming up Halifax Harbor about 8 a.m. Unfortunately, there's an outgoing ship, the Norwegian ship Emo, that's on the way out, is in a bit of a hurry on the wrong side of the harbor. The two ships collide in the Narrows, the Narrows part of Halifax Harbor. And the collision sets the aviation gas on fire. Mont Blanc drifts gradually over to the north end of Halifax, a neighborhood called Richmond. With her cargo of explosive cooking. And then at 9:04:40 seconds on December the 6th, 1917, Mont Blanc explodes, the largest man-made explosion until the atomic bomb. And a huge explosion that devastates the north end of Halifax. Now, prior to her explosion, as the ship was burning, a railway dispatcher, Vincent Coleman, you probably know the story from the Heritage Minutes, his station, small wooden station in the middle of the Richmond railway yards, was used to control freight trains. And he initially reports a burning ship drifting in the harbor, and then a naval sailor rushes in and warns them that the ship is actually full of explosives and they should clear out. Coleman stays at his position on his telegraph key, and that's the actual telegraph key he was using, and sends out a series of more detailed warnings, ending with the very famous one about munition ship burning, about to explode, stop all the trains. I guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. And when the explosion occurs, he is killed at his station. That's smashed to pieces by the air blast, and then swamped by the tsunami. But his message had got out, and not only had it stopped trains, it also alerted the whole intercolonial railway station to exactly what was going to happen, which allowed them to respond very quickly. So that blast takes the north end of Halifax. Here's a view in 1900s with all of its busy railway yards and docks and factories and closely packed wooden worker housing, and transforms it into this scene of Hiroshima-like destruction. Here's the area of Richmond, busy working class neighborhood. The ground zero is just off to your right of your screen, what was called Pier 6, which disappeared with the explosion, along with Mont Blanc, the ship that blew up into hundreds of thousands of fragments. And as you can see, this busy working class neighborhood was just turned into flattened and eventually burning ruins of houses and factories. And the railway lines, you can see the main lines coming into the Richmond Yards and Halifax North Street Station were then buried in huge amounts of debris and twisted, torn, and eviscerated railway rolling stock. So this was the explosion that killed nearly 2,000 people, devastated the north end of Halifax, and required help from the outside. Now, here's a map that sort of plots out some of our players here. Mont Blanc in the center is ground zero, that the ship that explodes and devastates the north end of Halifax. Vincent Coleman, where he is killed, reporting on the explosion, is red dot at center. However, there's a couple of other important players here. The morning train from Kentville is fortunately running a bit late. It was supposed to have arrived at 9, which would have put it right beside ground zero, but it was held up at Windsor Junction, so it's in Bedford, rolling towards the city with Dr. Avery DeWitt. At Fairview Station is the overnight train from St. John, New Brunswick, with 4 passenger cars, baggage, and a mail car. And it is stopped by Coleman's message at Fairview Station. And the windows are all blown out, but nobody is hurt, and the train is safe. And then the other player we're going to hear a bit about is the general manager of the Dominion Atlantic Railway. He is in his business car at North Street Station, just sitting down to breakfast with his steward and his daughter when the explosion occurs. So I'll talk about these folks and how they come together in this story, but that's where they are at the moment of the explosion. Now, George Graham, as I mentioned, was in his business car, the Nova Scotia car that still exists today, preserved at the Toronto Railway Museum. It was this kind of beautifully outfitted classic manager's car with a boardroom, sleeping quarters, nice dining room, and a kitchen and a steward. And he was in Halifax with his daughter, Helen Graham, and up here for meetings. When the explosion occurred, the train was pummeled by the blast, but the Graham and the 2 people he was with were protected from the explosion, although his daughter got a nasty cut from the explosion. But they were okay. About a dozen people killed all around them, but the Nova Scotia car saved them. And George then took off to the north, while his daughter went south. Helen went towards downtown to get treatment for her cut. She would actually end up discovering that there were other people far more badly injured, so she ended up volunteering all night long at one of the improvised hospitals. George Graham, though, went north to try to find a working telegraph. He could tell the lines were all down from this colossal explosion, and he wanted to summon help. So he does this awful walk through the devastated North End Halifax, following the line of the train tracks, buried in rubble, in destroyed rolling stock, and bodies. He counts 25 bodies along the train tracks as he heads from the station heading towards to find a working telegraph key. This is a picture taken on December the 9th, but it gives you an idea of where he walked through. This is a cut of view looking towards Piers 6, 7, and 8. And the only signs of life he finds amid these piles of wreckage that is starting to burn is the number 10 train from St. John, New Brunswick. It rolls around the curve slowly as the engineer and conductor try to figure out what's happened, and then comes to a stop just about where the new bridge, the Mackay Bridge, is, and then the track is blocked by rubble. The train, as Graham witnesses, is immediately swamped by people dragging themselves from the wreckage with all these terrible wounds, seeking assistance from this one sort of intact piece of civilization. Graham, however, doesn't have time to stop and help. He wants to get to that telegraph key, and he has to walk all the way to Rockingham, where he finds a train station which with a working telegraph key. Graham was an interesting guy. He really kind of built the DAR and served on as running it for decades. It started off as a telegrapher in British Columbia, and he knew Morse code really well. So apparently, he sort of took the young intercolonial railway clerk and said, "Give me the key," and sends this message to Halifax. This very succinct and impressive message to organize a relief train, send word to Wolfville and Windsor, round up doctors, nurses, and all Red Cross supplies possible. No time to explain details, but list of casualties is enormous. So it's kind of this really important message from the boss, the general manager, telling people exactly what they need, prioritizing what's needed, and telling his railway to get moving. And it arrives in Kentville at about 10 o'clock on the morning of December the 6th. Here's a picture of Kentville Station in 1915, showing its busy wartime role, a place where people went off to war, where the wounded came back, where information was exchanged, and where the vast amount of supplies headed for the war effort came. It's a picture of a recruitment drive at the station in 1915. So this message arrives from the general manager, and then everybody springs into action. The railway staff start marshaling together a train, and they send word by runner to all the doctors and nurses in Kentville that are available to get ready to go help Halifax. And we have some quite dramatic accounts from people in Kentville about kind of what they did when they received the word. This was Dr. Willis Moore, longtime family doctor in Kentville. He was also the railway doctor at the time. And he gets word right away, just as he's about to start his morning round of house calls, and throws together his kit and heads down to the station. And the other accounts we have, there was one nurse who was in such a hurry to get to the station when she heard this. She'd been ironing her nurse's uniform, and she just grabbed her coat, went out the door, left her iron, and burned right through her uniform. So these folks kind of gather at the Kentville station to board this train that's being put together. We don't have a picture of the train, but this is a great picture from Chris Gertrude's collection of a DR train in 1915 in the wintertime. Gives you a good idea of what the rescue train would have looked like from Kentville. We don't know the locomotive. I suspect it was one of their two big new Baldwins, either number 32 or 33, their fastest locomotives, and it's put together with baggage cars and passenger cars to take these doctors and nurses. So the good contingent from Kentville shows up. Dr. Willis Moore, as I mentioned, Dr. Percy McGrath, who's the Army doctor at Camp Aldershot. He arrives very quickly, and as well as a number of doctors and nurses, another doctor named Webster, and several nurses arrive to board the train. So, as I mentioned, they put together this train. The engineer is a fellow named James Leach. And you can see him, he's the older guy with the coveralls in the center of the photo on the left. He is highly motivated to get this train here and quickly because he's based out of Halifax. His wife and his 5 children are at Room Street, which is very close to the harbor and almost right on top of Ground Zero. So he really wants to get to Halifax to help them. And the conductor, Harry Taylor, a longtime conductor on the DAR, he's got a brother on Barrington near North Street, right on the edge of the destructed area. So the two of them are in charge of this train, and they are anxious to get the help to Halifax, but also to see to their own families. And we'll find out what they discover when they arrive. As I mentioned, we don't know the locomotive. I'd like to think it was locomotive number 32. It was either 32 or 33. Here's a model of locomotive number 32 that was built by a DAR employee, Arthur Caldwell. It was a freight handler and later freight manager in Halifax, and he built this model of one of the DAR's flagship locomotives in 1908. The model was actually in Halifax and was damaged by the explosion, but later repaired and became a real sort of centerpiece of Annapolis Valley, a sort of apple blossom festival floats, etc. You can see this model, a big 1/12 scale model at the Wolfville Library donated by Gary Ness. So I like to imagine number 32 was at the head of this train that rolls out of Kentville Station about 11 a.m. On December the 6th, just 2 hours after the explosion, to begin its journey to pick up other doctors and nurses in Wolfville and Windsor and bring help to Halifax. So the first stop is Wolfville. They arrive about 11:30. Wolfville had been alerted at 10 to start to put together doctors and nurses. Here's a lovely station, still stands in Wolfville, almost brand new at this point, built in 1912. And it is the focal point of doctors and nurses hustling together to get on this train bound for Halifax. We know quite a bit about the people from Wolfville. The Katy University kept good notes about who went. So there were three doctors. George DeWitt, he is the father of Avery DeWitt, the fellow who was heading into Halifax that morning. And then Dr. Elliott, Dr. Allen, a whole bunch of nurses, including Georgina Milner. You saw her, Georgina Miner, you saw her watch at the beginning. And a druggist, H.E. Calkin from the town. He arrives with his drugs and painkillers. And three university professors from Acadia, who I guess they figured that they would be able to help as well. So these folks all board the train and head to Halifax. Nice shot of the station in Wolfville during the wartime, 1914, mixture of civilians and uniforms, much as it would have looked that morning when people boarded. There's Georgina Miner, the young nurse who boarded the train as part of the contingent of nurses who left from the valley. Then the next stop is Windsor. Nice postcard of the old the Windsor station, and so the train arrives there at about noon. We have less details of folks from Windsor, but we know there were two doctors, Dr. Ernest Bissett and Dr. Clarence Morris, as well as more doctors and nurses and Red Cross supplies that were loaded up on the train. The last stop to assemble the team for Halifax, and then they rolled out of Windsor. Now, and you can just imagine James Leach opening up the throttle, leaving Windsor. There's that big uphill grade heading up towards Uniacke. You got to climb up on that, but no more stops. And he knows his family is in Halifax, and who knows what's happened to them. His sister-in-law later recalled in an interview, he drove it so fast, they said afterwards, it was a wonder they weren't all killed. So you can just imagine them rolling through the wilderness north of Windsor. Nice shot of a DAR train in the World War I era at speed in Hebron down in Yarmouth County, giving you an idea of what this voyage would have looked like. So the train is rocketing towards Halifax. They have one more stop at Windsor Junction, where the DAR meets the intercolonial main line, what's now CN. And so if you can see, there's a freight train in this picture curving off to the left. Just imagine that's our rescue train from Kentville, who's entering the Y at Windsor Junction. And this is where you get clearance to proceed into Halifax on the Intercolonials line. Now, just as they're pulling into Windsor Junction to get the okay to go into Halifax, an outgoing train arrives from Halifax. See the string of boxcars? Imagine that's the outgoing train. That's train number 10. That overnight train from St. John that had rolled into the north end of Halifax. And that train was right in the center of the devastated area, cut off from the rest of the city, and it just became a magnet for injured people who then piled onto the train. And the passengers and crew of the train then started doing improvised first aid, ripping up bedding from the sleeping berths and tablecloths from the small dining car to treat all these horrible wounded people. 210 wounded people board the train number 10 in the north end of Halifax. And the conductor manages to get his locomotive turned around and fueled and water, and then gets clearance to haul this wounded train of people and they just figured the best thing to do is to get them to Truro. So they are very lucky because they meet Avery DeWitt, the young doctor from Wolfville, who I mentioned was heading into Halifax that morning for a meeting. He meets George Graham, who says, go join train number 10 in the north end of Halifax. They need every help they can get. So he is on board this train as it rolls out of Halifax, windows broken, full of bleeding people, and starts to treat the 210 wounded people aboard train number 10. He starts at the beginning of the train where the conductor set up a little operating theater for him in the baggage carriage, and he does 125 surgeries on a rolling train, going from Halifax to Truro, to look after all these patients. And this patient at this train stuffed with injured people meets the Valley train at Windsor Junction. And the conductor of the Truro bound train says, "Do you have anybody who can help us?" So Dr. Avery DeWitt's father, George DeWitt, who's just coming from Wolfville, he and his daughter, Nellie DeWitt, who's a nurse, they board the train and they start to assist treating these hundreds of injured patients. They start at the back of the train. They don't know that their son, Avery DeWitt, is working at the front of the train in the baggage car. And on that journey to Truro, they work through the train treating people, bandaging wounds, stopping hemorrhaging so people don't bleed out and die, removing debris, and removing especially lots of glass that are impacted in eyes. And it's not until they get to Truro that father and son discover each other, that they're both on this heavily laden train full of wounded people. And they have a brief family reunion, the three DeWitts. And then they discover that they're in Truro. This town is undamaged, but every doctor and nurse in Truro has gone to Halifax on the first train from Truro that went into Halifax. So the DeWitts end up spending days and days in Truro, working at improvised hospitals in Truro, treating all these folks from Halifax. So the Valley already playing a vital role in they've evacuated wounded from Halifax. Now back to our train from the Valley with conductor James Leach at the throttles. It then proceeds to Halifax. And this is a picture of the sort of the north end. I've reversed it a bit to imagine our train arriving in the north end, slowly pulling into the wreckage-choked tracks of the north end of Halifax that had just been vacated by the train that had headed to Truro. And they get as far as the area of the Richmond Yards, where the track is buried in wreckage, and then they come to a halt. The doctors and nurses and people assisting them with the Red Cross supplies then struggle through Barrington Street that is just buried under heaps of rubble and toppled telephone and electrical poles, heading to the south to try to find a hospital or someplace that they can assist in the wounded. This sort of going through this abysmal, hellish scene of destruction. Of everything is flattened, and even worse, buildings are burning. And Dr. Willis Moore, he describes it was like a scene from Dante's Inferno of hell, of flames leaping from craters that were once the basement of houses, people dragging burned corpses from ruins, people desperately staggering through the smoke looking for family members. Dr. McGrath, the doctor from Camp Aldershot, recalls bodies stacked like cordwood along the side of the street as improvised rescue teams pulled bodies, stacked them, and then went back in the wreckage looking for living people. So it seemed like a hopeless scene of chaos until they arrive at North Street on the edge of the devastated area. And this gives you another sense of the moonscape of North End Halifax that they would have walked through. This is the area surrounding the Richmond Yards. But when they get to North Street, the streets are clear, and they're met by a fleet of cars and trucks and wagons who know they're coming and say, "Good, you're here. We're going to distribute you to the hospitals that need extra help." And the reason that they're suddenly met by this organized response is because there'd been a meeting at Halifax City Hall at 11:30 that morning. The deputy mayor sort of called together a meeting to organize Halifax's response. And sort of an hour and a half after the explosion, he pulls together all the city councilors, the representatives of the police and the military to try to prioritize what they're going to do. And this really, some folks have called it the most important meeting in the history of Halifax because the city had all the recipes for just total helpless chaos. The fire chief was dead, the deputy fire chief was dead, the head of the superintendent of the Intercolonial Railway was badly injured, mayor was out of town, the premier was out of town. But all the acting people stepped up and immediately formed teams, one to set up improvised hospitals, one to deal with transport, one to deal with rounding up food, one to set up emergency housing, and one to set up a big mortuary for all the dead they knew were coming. And so they were the ones who'd organized the cars and trucks which greet the train from Kentville and take them to the hospitals. Georgina Miner, the young nurse, she is taken to an improvised hospital at the Knights of Columbus Hall on Barrington Street, and she'll spend the next week looking after wounded and assisting the one doctor there. Two nurses go to an improvised hospital ship, the Old Colony, which the naval surgeons in the harbors have all got together in this ship to do surgeries on an improvised hospital ship. Most of the folks from Kentville end up at Camp Hill Hospital. This is an air picture of Camp Hill from the 1930s, but it's how it looked in World War I. It's where the whole Queen Elizabeth Health Complex is in Halifax today. But it was built as a hospital to assist wounded soldiers from France with follow-up surgeries and physiotherapy and recuperation. So it was a brand new hospital. It had one operating theater, but lots of ward space. And in addition to the good old Victoria General, the infirmary, and a bunch of other military hospitals, it was an area that people just congregated in. Cars and trucks and walking wounded arrived at the doors of Camp Hill Hospital, overwhelming the 3 or 4 doctors on duty. And so the Kentville doctors were immediately put to work at Camp Hill Hospital as the wounded kept coming, hundreds and hundreds of them. Here's an image of a military ambulance sort of delivering people to Camp Hill Hospital. They were working in darkness with windows covered in blankets and doing surgeries by lantern and dealing with thousands of patients. There were about 10,000 people injured by the explosion, and they just kept coming. Dr. Moore kind of talked about doing surgeries all night long in Camp Hill by lantern light, and the grim task of making triages, deciding, who they might be able to save, who they couldn't save, and who would just be made comfortable to die, and then people who could just sit with their injuries and wait to be treated the next day. As they did surgery after surgery, suturing up bodies, and removing debris, and especially removing glass from eyes. All the doctors talked about the enormous number of eye injuries. Many people were actually looking out the window, watching the rising column of smoke and the burning ship at the time, and the window came in and ruined their eyes. And you had to remove a damaged eyeball and clear the glass out, otherwise infection would set in and kill the patient. And one of the doctors recalls grimly had memories of a bucket full of eyeballs he'd removed as they operated on patient after patient. Dr. Willis Moore from Kentville kind of said you would expect it to be angry chaos, but it was actually an eerie silence. As people waited their turn, doctors and nurses did one surgery after another in a strange quiet as they worked their way through these cases all night long. We don't have a picture of Camp Hill, but this is a picture of one of the improvised hospitals. This one was at the St. Mary's College on Windsor Street. And you can get a sense of a lot of the improvised hospitals where they kind of pulled together beds and doctors kind of worked in kind of improvised conditions. And here's the doctor treating 2 children. A lot of child injuries from the Halifax explosion. In fact, the pediatric surgery learned a whole bunch of lessons from the Halifax explosion, as well as the eye surgeons, about dealing with these mass casualty incidents. And it gives you an idea of what Dr. Moore from Kentville, Dr. McGrath, and the other folks from the Valley would have dealt with as they worked all through that night, had a bit of a rest in the day, and then continued working. And most of them spent 2 or 3 days in Halifax. Some of them worked in Halifax for a week until further medical personnel arrived from further afield. So turning from the doctors to the trainmen, what do they discover? Poor engineer James Leach, he discovered that his house is gone. It's completely destroyed. They can't even really find it. The neighborhood along Broome Street is so devastated. But he discovers that his wife is badly injured, but she'd been pulled from the wreckage by his two older children. However, his 6-year-old son, Arthur Leach, is nowhere to be found. He was headed to school. They think he went down near the harbor to watch the burning ship. His body was never found. The family kind of believes he was probably pulled out to ocean into the ocean by the tidal wave. So he discovered no home, his wife badly injured, and a lost son. Kind of a grim toll from the explosion. Harry Taylor discovers that his brother is okay. The family have lost their house, but they're sheltering under the front steps. And he receives a pass. This is something that happened in Halifax. The military and the police very quickly set up a security cordon around the devastated area of the north end of Halifax. The police would issue these passes if you could prove you had family in the area of the north end where everything was smashed up, and then you would be able to show this to the soldiers who were standing there with fixed bayonets, and they would let you in to look after relatives or try to secure your property. Because of that, there was actually very little looting after the explosion. So here's Harry Taylor's actual pass to visit his brother's place at 919 Barrington Street, and at least he has good news that his family is okay. Um, Here's the death toll for the DAR and its employees in Halifax. That's a picture of Walter Manning. Very sad story for him. He'd left work for that day to run a train to the valley, and his daughter Mary Manning really loved railroading, and she was only 8 years old, but she went off on him in the locomotive that day, so she survived. But his wife and his three daughters were killed in their house. They were very close to ground zero by Duffield Street, and basically his entire family and his house were obliterated. And other DAR employees lost folks. John Menney, he lost a daughter. Conductor Morris Williams lost a wife and two children. And there were also 4 DAR employees based in Halifax. Conductor Alfred Frizzell, another conductor Herman Weiss, Frederick Hessian, a brakeman, and John Matheson, a car inspector, who were killed. So the DAR itself suffered considerable losses. And this is only one of the railways in Halifax. The Intercolonial had 60 employees who were killed by the explosion. So there was a real toll on the railways on people in the railways. But I want to give a bit of context to this train from Kentville, because it wasn't the only one, but it's in a microcosm of what happened to 10 different trains from across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick who arrived the day of the explosion when help was needed the most. It was the train from Truro that was there first at just before 12:30. So kind of 2.5 hours from the after the explosion, help had arrived from Truro, full of doctors and nurses. The Kentville train was second, and then a train from that came from Sackville, New Brunswick, and then picked up doctors and nurses in Amherst came into the afternoon. They also brought the entire Amherst Fire Department on flat cars. A train from New Glasgow and Stellarton arrives at 4 p.m. The city of Moncton sends 4 different trains the day of the explosion, arriving into the evening starting at 11 p.m. And they bring doctors and nurses, medical supplies, as well as railway workers to kind of clear the line, and hospital cars that were designed to transport Canadian wounded soldiers from hospital ships. They bring them into Halifax to assist. Then there's a train from Pictou that arrives early the next morning, and then a train from St. John, New Brunswick that arrives at 7:30 the next morning, just as the heavy snow starts to fall. The snow, as you may know, blizzard hit Halifax the day after the explosion and held up all the other incoming trains for another day. So these 10 trains that brought 60 doctors from across the Maritimes to double the medical capacity of Halifax all arrived that first day when help was really needed for emergency trauma surgery. This is a bit of a detail from the Canadian Railway and Marine world about some of those trains and the distances they travel, the types of cars they had aboard, and the help that they brought. And this is emergency relief that you never hear about. Everybody talks about the trains that came from Boston and New York. Nobody ever mentions the vital help that actually came from towns and cities across the Maritimes the very day of the explosion, arguably when the outside help was the most critical. So yeah, the first trains that arrived to Halifax are local trains. They're from our region, and the Americans don't start to pull in until December the 8th, 9th, and 10th when their trains start to arrive. And the Americans bring good help. The emergency medical surgery is all done with, though. Basically, what they do when they arrive is they give a break to all these Nova Scotia and New Brunswick doctors and nurses, and they start to work on the long-term help with rehabilitation and especially housing. The Americans do valuable work there, but their arrival kind of overlooks the vital work that the local railways did. This is the North Street station. The roof had partially collapsed by the explosion, but the railway went right to work, and actually, remarkably, given the number of people who in the road who'd been killed and the amount of equipment they lost, they have everything up and running on December the 9th. 3 days after the explosion, they resume their full timetable of service out of the North Street station. And this is a picture taken about December the 9th. The very first scheduled train to resume service is the evening train to Kentville on the Dominion Atlantic Railway. So and the railway allows massive resources to come to Halifax to help wounded and injured, help the homeless who need shelter, but also rebuild the docks, the wharves, the tracks, the freight sheds. And Halifax bumps back and is fully running as a port within a week of the explosion. Now, however, as I mentioned, it's the American help that kind of gets all the attention, and partially because the Americans came up not only with doctors and nurses, they also brought reporters and PR agents who were quickly writing stories about how they saved Halifax and how all was helpless chaos until they arrived. And it's sadly kind of overshadowed the important local work that was done in Halifax and by folks from towns around the region. And so to this day, we send a tree to Boston every year as sort of a thank you. But nobody's ever sent a tree to Truro or to Moncton. And it's that tree tradition, by the way, it's a nice tradition. People love it. It didn't start right after the explosion. People will tell you it started in 1918, but it was started in 1971 by the Lunenburg County tree growers who wanted to promote Christmas tree exports. And it's continued ever since. And it's become this sort of a big PR exercise the province of Nova Scotia does. People love it. But it would be nice if somebody would recognize the folks from, who brought help right away when it was needed most. About the only thank you that the folks from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick ever got were informal gestures. Georgina Miner, who I mentioned, worked as a volunteer nurse at a hospital at the Knights of Columbus Hall. The elders of the Knights of Columbus put together some money, and they gave her and the other doctors and nurses a little gold nurse's watch engraved as a sort of a personal thank you for their help. The only official recognition any of these folks from the Maritimes ever got. So that's my sort of story about this one train from Kentville, which brought help to Halifax after the explosion. Is a real window on the vital, speedy response brought by trains from across the Maritimes at the time of the explosion. A few good sources if you ever want to learn more. The Graham Metzen put together a book called The Halifax Explosion, published in the late 70s. It has Willis Moore's account going to Halifax, as well as good summary of all the trains. And a recent book by Joseph Scanlon, sort of a very detailed look at the explosion, was published 3 years ago. It also has good stuff on the local help and the role of the railways. And there was a couple of good articles in Canadian Railway magazine, one in 1997 and one in 2001, that look at the railways response in detail, that are worth turning to if you want to know more about all the trains for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick who came to Halifax's aid the very day of the explosion and made a really important difference that we shouldn't forget. So those are some of the folks who kind of helped images capturing this kind of moment in history 108 years ago. And I will be happy to take your questions.